I'm Curt Miner, and I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about contemporary concerns in understanding curriculum as a theological text. In the last half of the 20th century, the number of private religious elementary and high schools in the United States rose dramatically. One consequence of this movement is that children who would normally be considered at risk or underprivileged are often much more successful in these private schools than their peers who remain in public schools. In addition to exploring some of the history of this private school movement, I want to look at two possible causes for these schools' surprising success. First, some history. The catalyst for the modern private school movement was a 1962 Supreme Court ruling. The school board of New Hyde Park, New York, wrote a small, non-denominational prayer and required students to recite it every morning before classes. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. Many of the students went home and told their parents about this, who complained to the school board that this violated their First Amendment rights against government-established religion. When the school board didn't listen, they got lawyers. The case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. They said that when a publicly funded institution, such as a school, requires students to participate in prayer, that constitutes the establishment of a religion and clearly violates the participants' rights. The following year, the Supreme Court declared that the practices of reading Bible verses at the beginning of the day and requiring students to recite the Lord's Prayer were both also unconstitutional. This opened a floodgate of separation of church and state cases. By 1971, the court developed what has become the de facto litmus test for determining whether a law, policy, or practice violates the separation clause. It's called the Lemon Test after the ruling Lemon v. Kurtzman. And it states that a law concerning religion is constitutional only if 1. The act has a clear secular legislative purpose, 2. The primary or principal effect neither advances nor inhibits religion, and 3. Whether or not it fosters excessive government entanglement with religion. At the same time schools were removing religious education from the curriculum, they were starting to include subjects like sex education. The cumulative weight of these two events prompted many conservatives to believe that public schools were purposely, intentionally undermining the fabric of American society in an attempt to indoctrinate the youth into liberalism. In response, many of them, mostly Protestants, did what Roman Catholics had done decades earlier: start their own schools to educate their children as they saw fit. The main controversy here has always been between religious parents and what they label as secular humanism being taught in schools instead of traditional religious values. According to the Humanist Manifesto, a secular humanist holds that all religious belief is harmful, and humankind is better off without its influence. They believe that we are not accountable to any sort of deity in any way, and we must free ourselves from such childish superstitions and assume responsibility for creating our own future collectively and individually. Up until this point, all the cases surrounding religion in schools had focused on the school system violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment by promoting Christianity. But in 1985, Mozart versus Hawkins County, Tennessee, turned this on its head and claimed that the school's new textbook violated their children's free exercise of religion by promoting a secular humanist viewpoint. By promoting these views, the parents argued, the government was in fact establishing a religion. This case made it all the way to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, but this time they ruled in favor of the state. They said that while students cannot be coerced to affirm ideas contrary to their own values, there is absolutely no need to prevent them from being exposed to ideas that they are unaccustomed to. One of the counters against this influence has been the push for a civic education in public schools. Civic education is a branch of social studies that includes the teaching on the history and influence of religion in America, as well as moral education in order to promote civic values and establish a common morality. It makes sense to include this in the public school curriculum because, historically speaking, public school teachers have had the primary responsibility for transferring what is known as our cultural legacy and heritage to the next generation. The Catholic Church addressed this issue in a fall 1987 conference when they declared that the dilution of a shared moral vision that bound Americans together has resulted in a catastrophic decline in moral education in public schools. By including moral and religious teaching in the curriculum rather than just teaching facts, educators hope to build a community dedicated to traditional democratic values and civic responsibilities. William Bennett, the former U.S. Secretary of Education and an outspoken critic of what he sees as a decline of American culture, argues that many of America's educational problems come not so much from students' ignorance of the 3 R's, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic, but from a failure of the schools to pass along a common culture consisting of what he calls the 3 C's: common values, common knowledge base, and common language. He and many others like him believe that communicating this common culture in a fact-based curriculum would revive American culture and produce greater economic productivity for all. Undersecretary of Education Gary Bauer takes this idea even further. He believes that schools should indoctrinate students into the fundamental values of a democratic and free society by teaching a common body of ethical knowledge, even if it has a religious origin. What a sharp contrast to the ideas of government only a decade earlier. Obviously, an idea like that is going to be met with criticism. In her book, The New Servants of Power, a critique of the 1980s school reform movement, Christine Shea writes that this appeal for a common core curriculum is actually an appeal for a new civic religion that blends Judeo-Christian morality with democratic ideals and patriotism. In their quest to reform, it appears traditionalists simply dressed their old ideas in new clothes and created a new religion made in their image. Some have even taken it a step further and argued that such a core conservative curriculum, designed to prepare students for responsible citizenship and create a cohesive political community, actually indoctrinates students into accepting the status quo and inoculates or vaccinates them against a desire to stand up or speak out against injustice and oppression in American society. In other words, the curriculum is designed to produce a kind of generic, conservative, Judeo-Christian American with a Bible in one hand and a flag in the other. But in doing so, it's self-defeating because it destroys individual liberties and undermines democratic and religious values. So, what's the alternative? For many people, the solution has been private schools, otherwise known as magnet schools. These magnet schools often have specialized curricula such as an emphasis on religious studies, performing arts, or even math and science. Funding for these schools has been one major source of controversy since they're not publicly supported. Parents who send their children to these schools already pay for public schools through their taxes, but their children are not attending the public schools. So should the government help them in the form of, say, vouchers or tax credits? Or do these parents simply bear the burden of their own choice by paying taxes and tuition? A double whammy. Many of these parents chose these schools specifically because they wanted their child's education to be infused with religious ideas and morality. In a Focus on the Family interview, Kay Wakas argues that because public schools are not allowed to teach the whole truth about God, and because the curriculum is deliberately secular in nature, children of Christian parents have no business attending them. Rather, they should be seen strictly as mission fields for Christian administrators and teachers. So we have these private schools now. How do they stack up against public schools? Actually, usually better. Most students from private schools consistently outperform public school students. And there's at least two reasons for this disparity. First, private religious schools tend to be closer to the American ideal of a common school than the public schools are, which have become increasingly institutionalized and impersonal. Teachers at private schools tend to be more committed to making sure students learn than public school teachers who are likely dealing with too many students and too many discipline problems to give much individual attention. Private school teachers spend more time on academic subjects than their public school counterparts. Classroom discipline is usually quite a bit more rigid in private schools, and the students are commonly assigned more homework than students in public schools. Private schools almost always have greater parental involvement than public schools because the parents chose to send their students there. Public schools often have almost no parental support at all, especially in these at-risk districts. What's more, despite the fact that public schools are legally required to meticulously respect the rights of all students, students who transfer to private schools where no such requirement exists say that they feel treated more fairly than they were back in public schools. Another likely reason for the greater success in private schools is the sense of community that these schools generate. By their very nature, public schools are diverse. Usually the only thing students have in common is that they live in the same district. Private schools, on the other hand, tend to be based on something called functional communities, which are usually faith-based. Functional communities help nurture students, and as a result, they develop something called social capital or human capital. There's a couple of different definitions. One is the value of social networks bonding similar people and bridging between diverse people with norms of reciprocity. The one I like best is the skills and capabilities that make people productive. This social capital is sorely lacking in public schools where there's little sense of community outside of isolated cliques. Studies conclude that this sense of community is especially important to students from disadvantaged or at-risk backgrounds, who experience a much higher success rate in private schools compared to their peers in public schools. Removing them from the world at large and placing them within a cohesive group where they can feel a sense of belonging and social responsibility seems to be what makes all the difference. These views were supported in a study by Susan D. Rose. She studied two separate evangelical groups and their schools. The schools are an effort to provide the children of these religious folks with a safe zone in a chaotic world and to transmit their Christian values. As an unintended byproduct, they're reproducing what they view as the ideal American social structure in their own communities. This supports the conclusion that educating the young is most successful when it takes place in a social setting accompanied by community building. We now have two possible, probable reasons for the success of private schools. First, private schools demand more discipline and academic rigor, yet offer more personalized attention than more institutional public schools. Second is the sense of social capital or human capital that these schools build, making the student feel like an important member of a community rather than just being a nameless face in a crowd. Abraham Lincoln said, "The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next." Many of the private schools were formed by people who understood that concept and were trying to protect what they saw as America's Christian heritage, the heartbeat of conservatism and the religious right. According to most studies, they seem to be succeeding.